summer of 1990, I worked in Conwy in North Wales, and there I met Joe Swan. Joe lived then and, so far as I know, still does, on his boat, which is also called the Swan. He was originally from Liverpool, but had spent several years sailing from place to place as the fancy took him, staying long enough to earn some money and then moving on. He had arrived in Conwy in 1989, when his boat had broken down, and he'd got a job working in a combination antique shop and tea room, which is where we met. His boat was moored opposite the main quayside at some distance from the shore. Now, late one evening in the summer of 1989, Joe was sitting on the deck of the Swan, just idly looking around the estuary. Unfortunately, he cannot remember the exact date, but it must have been in late August or early September. The time was around 11 o'clock, and the quayside was deserted. As his glance roamed idly over the quay and the waterside pub, the Liverpool Arms, his eye was caught by a figure standing close to the automatic binocular machine which is used frequently by children to look at the boats in the estuary. Although it was growing dark, there was still enough light from the quayside lamps to see the figure quite clearly. Joe described it to me as being dressed like a member of the Ku Klux Klan, in a long white robe. But the hood was not pointed, it was more rounded. And when I suggested it sounded like a monk's habit, he readily agreed. The figure seemed to have a smaller figure, dressed in either black or very deep blue, standing in front of him. Joe has a telescope, and stretching out his hand, he picked it up and trained it on the form. He could now see it in greater clarity, and he was very surprised to see that the face appeared as a white blank with just black shadows in place of the eyes. Although he could not see the eyes, he nonetheless had the distinct feeling that the shape was watching him closely. Moving the telescope lower down, he realized that the darker figure was that of a small female child dressed in a long, dark dress. At this point, he saw the landlord of the Liverpool Arms come out of the pub door and begin picking up empty glasses which customers had left on the stone wall of the quayside. He walked past the otherworldly figure without speaking, which was unusual, since the landlord had a reputation as a jolly, hail-fellow, well-met sort of man, always ready with a word or joke for customers or passer-by. The landlord picked up the empties and returned to the pub, once more passing the shapes of the binoculars without registering their presence. The pub door closed, and Joe was left to observe a deserted quayside. Deserted, that is, except for the motionless figures who were still staring at him. Joe began to feel slightly uneasy, despite his firmly stated disbelief in anything to do with the supernatural. Then the lights on the quay began to go out, one by one. But still the silent, unmoving watchers remained gazing steadfastly towards Joe's boat. Casting a swift glance around the harbour, Joe realized that his boat was the only one carrying lights. For some reason that he could not explain, Joe suddenly felt very vulnerable, and taking his eye momentarily from the eyepiece of the telescope, he reached behind him and switched off the boat's lights. He immediately renewed his vigil at the telescope, but the figures had vanished. The quayside was empty. There was nowhere that the apparitions, if that is what they were, could have gone in the second or two that he had not been watching. he let his telescope range from end to end of the quay. It was completely deserted. Feeling totally bewildered, Joe went to bed. The night was calm, and the water of the estuary placid and undisturbed. The weather forecast for the night was for calm and wind-free conditions. However, at around 2 a.m, the Swan began to pitch and dip violently. So violently, in fact, that her keel repeatedly struck the bottom of the river. Joe slept very little for the rest of the night, though he did take a couple of looks at neighbouring craft, and was amazed to see that none of them was suffering the same rapid rise and fall as was the Swan. As soon as it was late enough the next morning, Joe made his way to the Liverpool Arms and spoke to the licensee. He told Joe that, yes, he had collected empties on the quay, just as Joe had seen him do, but no, he'd not seen anything of the 2 shapes which Joe had observed. At first, this was the only reference I could find in Conwy to a spectral monk, but then, almost at the end of Margaret Williams's The Ghosts of Conwy, I found a curious little story of how, one night, she went to take her dog for a walk in the castle grounds, but the animal refused to pass through the gate, and she'd had to return home. Only the next day did she discover that just at that time, a hooded and robed figure had been seen walking the castle walls above the gate under which her dog refused to pass. Maybe the Phantom Brother had been disturbed from his usual haunts and had decided to pay Joe a visit. After all, Joe's boat was moored a matter of yards from Margaret's smallest house in Britain. Or maybe it was just another of those ghosts who go down to the sea in ships.